What would you do if a simple tattoo suddenly changed everything you thought about a person? It was supposed to be a normal traffic stop on a quiet, rainy night. Officer Daniels had pulled over an old pickup truck crawling slowly down an empty highway. Nothing looked unusual. The truck was old, the driver looked calm, and it seemed like the stop would be over in less than a minute. But then, Daniels noticed something strange. On the driver's forearm was one of the weirdest tattoos he had ever seen. It wasn't a dragon or a skull or some fancy artwork. Instead, it was just numbers, lines, and small dots. At first glance, it looked like random scribbles, almost like someone had let a child draw on their arm. So the officer laughed. His partner laughed too. "Nice tattoo," they joked. "What is that? Some kind of alien language?" The driver didn't laugh. He just sat there quietly, calm, patient, like he had heard that joke 100 times before. But then something happened that instantly wiped the smile off Officer Daniels' face. He looked at the tattoo again, and suddenly he recognized it. Those numbers weren't random. Those lines weren't decoration. They were coordinates. Real coordinates. Coordinates used in secret military operations. The kind of codes most civilians would never even recognize. In that moment, the officer realized something shocking. The quiet man sitting in that old truck wasn't just another driver on the highway. He was someone who had once been part of something far bigger, something dangerous, something most people would never understand. But what happened next was even more powerful, because when the officer finally asked the man what the tattoo meant, the answer revealed a story of courage, sacrifice, and a mission that saved lives, but also took some. A story so emotional that it completely changed the way the officers looked at that man and the strange tattoo they had just laughed at. By the end of this encounter, what started as a simple traffic stop turned into a moment of deep respect that neither officer would ever forget. So what exactly did those mysterious numbers mean? What mission was hidden inside that tattoo? And why did the man choose to carry that memory permanently on his arm? Stay with me until the end, because this story proves something powerful. Sometimes the things we laugh at are carrying the heaviest stories of all. Pull over. Now! Flashing red and blue lights reflected across the wet highway as Officer Daniels followed an old pickup truck slowly crawling along the roadside. The road outside the city was nearly empty that night. Rain fell gently from the dark sky, and the sound of tires sliding through shallow water echoed across the quiet highway. Something about the truck had caught Daniel's attention. It looked worn out, very worn out. The paint was faded, the back bumper was slightly bent, and one of the headlights flickered every few seconds. It looked like the kind of vehicle that had traveled thousands of miles and had seen better days. The driver wasn't speeding or driving recklessly. Still, Daniels had been a police officer long enough to trust his instincts. Sometimes something just felt off. The pickup slowed down and finally pulled onto the shoulder of the road. Daniels parked his patrol car behind it and stepped outside. Cold rain lightly tapped against his jacket as he walked toward the vehicle. His partner, Officer Reed, remained inside the patrol car watching the situation carefully. Daniels approached the driver's window and knocked gently. Inside sat a man who looked around his late 30s, maybe early 40s. He had short dark hair, a rough beard, and calm eyes that seemed strangely relaxed for someone who had just been pulled over by the police. He wore a simple black hoodie and worn-out jeans, the kind someone might wear after a long day of work. But something about him stood out. He didn't look nervous. Most drivers showed at least some tension when stopped by police, but this man sat comfortably, almost patiently, as if the situation didn't bother him at all. Daniels tapped the window again. The driver rolled it down slowly. "Evening," Daniels said. "Evening." The man replied calmly. His voice was steady, almost emotionless. "License and registration, please." The man nodded and reached into his pocket without hesitation. He handed over his driver's license along with the truck's registration papers. Daniels glanced at the license. The name read Michael Carter. Daniels quickly checked the information on his patrol device. No criminal record. No outstanding warrants. Everything looked perfectly normal. Daniels was about to hand the documents back when something caught his attention. As the man moved his arm slightly, the sleeve of his hoodie pulled back just enough to reveal something on his forearm. A tattoo, but not an ordinary tattoo. Daniels leaned slightly closer to get a better look. The design was strange. Instead of a picture, it was made up of numbers, thin lines, tiny dots, and small symbols arranged in a very unusual pattern. At first glance, it almost looked like some kind of puzzle or code. Daniels stared at it for a second before chuckling. "Well, that's interesting," he said. The man looked down briefly at his arm, but didn't react. "What's it supposed to be?" Daniels asked with a slight grin. The man shrugged. "Just a tattoo." Daniels smiled wider. "Just a tattoo?" he repeated. Officer Reed, still sitting in the patrol car, leaned forward trying to see what Daniels was looking at. "What is it?" Reed called out. Daniels motioned him over. "Come take a look at this." Reed stepped out of the car and walked over curiously. When he saw the tattoo, his eyebrows lifted. "What in the world is that?" he asked. Daniels laughed. "Your guess is as good as mine." Reed leaned closer to the open window to examine the strange design. The tattoo was definitely unusual. A thin line stretched across the arm like a tiny map. Around it were small groups of numbers. Some were separated by dots, while others were connected with thin lines that crossed each other. "Looks like someone let a kid draw on his arm," Reed joked. Daniels laughed again. "Yeah, exactly." The man inside the truck remained silent. He simply sat there calmly, watching the rain hit the windshield. Daniels crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly. "You know," he said jokingly, "I've seen a lot of tattoos while working as a cop, but I've never seen anything like this." Reed smirked. "Maybe it's alien language." Daniels chuckled. "Yeah, or maybe he lost a bet." The man slowly turned his head toward them. For a brief moment, his eyes showed something subtle. Not anger, not embarrassment, just patience. Like someone who had heard the same joke many times before. Daniels noticed the expression, but didn't think much about it. He leaned closer to look at the tattoo again. The more he studied it, the stranger it seemed. The symbols looked extremely precise. The numbers were carefully placed. Nothing about it seemed random. Still, Daniels shrugged it off. "Well," he said casually, "that's definitely the weirdest tattoo I've ever seen." The man looked at him calmly. "Most people say that." Reed laughed again. "I bet they do." Daniels handed the driver's license back through the window. "Well, Mr. Carter, everything looks fine," he said. "No violations tonight." Rain continued falling softly around them. Daniels turned slightly, preparing to walk back to his patrol car. But before leaving, he glanced once more at the tattoo. Something about it bothered him. He leaned closer again, studying the pattern more carefully this time. The numbers, the lines, the small dots. Suddenly his smile began to fade. The longer he stared, the more familiar the design seemed. Reed noticed the change immediately. "What's wrong?" Reed asked. Daniels didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on the tattoo. Now he wasn't laughing anymore, not even a little. A memory was slowly forming in his mind. Something from years ago. Something from before he became a police officer. His voice became quieter. "Where did you get that tattoo?" Daniels asked. The man looked straight ahead through the rain-covered windshield. "Just a tattoo," he replied calmly. But Daniels knew something was different now. His heart began beating slightly faster, because the strange symbols on that man's arm suddenly didn't look random anymore. In fact, they looked exactly like something Daniels had seen before, something he remembered from a very different life. Officer Daniels kept staring at the tattoo on the man's forearm. Just seconds earlier, he had been laughing at it, thinking it was some strange piece of random body art. But now, the more he looked at it, the more something in his mind began to shift. The lines, the numbers, the small dots placed between them. They weren't random at all. Daniels slowly leaned closer to the truck window. "Where did you get that tattoo?" he asked again, this time much more seriously. The man sat quietly in the driver's seat, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. Like I said, the man replied softly, "It's just a tattoo." Daniels didn't smile this time. His eyes stayed fixed on the pattern. Something deep in his memory was starting to come back. Years ago, before becoming a police officer, Daniels had spent a short time in the military. It hadn't been a long career, but during his training, he had been exposed to certain things most civilians would never recognize. One of those things was a special kind of coordinate system used during tactical missions. And the strange design on this man's arm looked dangerously similar. Daniel stepped back from the truck slowly. Officer Reed immediately noticed a change in his partner's face. "What's going on?" Reed asked quietly. Daniels lowered his voice. "Come here," he said. Reed stepped closer, confused. Daniels pointed toward the tattoo. "Look at those numbers," he whispered. Reed shrugged. "Yeah, I see numbers. And the lines connecting them." Daniels continued. Reed leaned closer again. "Okay, so what?" Daniels glanced back toward the man in the truck, making sure he wasn't paying attention. Then he spoke even quieter. "That's not random." Reed frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniels pulled out his phone and opened an old photo stored in his files. It was something he had kept from his time in the military training program years ago. He held the screen next to the tattoo. Reed's expression slowly changed as he compared the two. Both designs had numbers arranged in similar patterns. Both used thin lines connecting small points. And both looked like some kind of map. Reed's eyes widened. "Wait, are you serious?" he whispered. Daniels nodded slowly. "That's a tactical coordinate layout," he said. Reed looked stunned. "You're saying that tattoo is military?" Daniels took a slow breath. "I'm not saying for sure," he replied, "but it sure looks like it." Reed looked back toward the truck driver. The man was sitting quietly, staring straight ahead as rain rolled down the windshield. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look worried. He looked patient, almost like he already knew what the officers were talking about. Daniels walked back toward the driver's window again. This time his attitude had completely changed. "Sir," he said calmly. The man turned his head slightly. "Yes." Daniels pointed toward the tattoo. "I need to ask you something about that." The man looked down at his arm briefly. Then he looked back up. "It's just ink," he said. Daniels shook his head slowly. "I don't think it is." The man didn't reply. For a moment, the rain was the only sound on the empty highway. Daniels rested one hand on the truck door. "Are you former military?" he asked. The man remained silent for a few seconds. Not defensive, not surprised, just quiet. Then he exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said. Officer Reed glanced at Daniels immediately. Daniels continued. "What branch?" he asked. The man looked forward again. "Army." Daniels nodded slightly. That answer alone didn't confirm anything, but it made Daniels even more curious. He pointed again toward the tattoo. "That design, it's not random, is it?" The man didn't answer right away. His eyes moved down toward his forearm again. For a moment, his calm expression changed. Something deeper appeared there, something heavier. Finally, he spoke. "No," he said quietly. Reed felt a chill run down his spine. Daniels kept his voice steady. "What does it mean?" The man rubbed his thumb slowly across the tattoo. "It's a location," he said. Daniels and Reed exchanged a quick glance. "A location?" Daniels repeated. The man nodded slightly. "Yes." Reed frowned. "A location for what?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked out at the dark highway. Cars passed occasionally in the distance, their headlights glowing through the rain. Daniels felt tension building. "Sir," he said carefully, "I need you to understand something." The man looked back at him. "That code," Daniels continued, "looks like something used in special operations." Silence. The man didn't react, but he also didn't deny it. Reed shifted uncomfortably beside Daniels. "So what exactly are we dealing with here?" Reed asked. The man finally looked directly at both officers. His eyes were calm, but there was something serious behind them. "Something from a long time ago," he said. Daniels studied his face carefully. This wasn't some random guy with a strange tattoo. The calm attitude, the controlled voice, the way he carried himself. Daniels had seen that kind of presence before. Military training left certain habits in people, and this man clearly had them. Daniels straightened slightly. "What kind of unit were you in?" he asked. The man hesitated again. For a few seconds, it seemed like he was deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke. "The kind that doesn't talk about it." Reed blinked. Daniels understood exactly what that meant. Special operations. Highly classified missions. The kind most people never hear about. Daniels slowly looked back at the tattoo one more time. What looked like a strange joke earlier now felt completely different. Those numbers, those lines, they weren't decoration. They were information. Important information. Possibly even dangerous information. Daniels lowered his voice. "Why would someone tattoo that on their arm?" he asked. The man looked at the pattern again. And this time, something emotional appeared in his expression. "It's a reminder," he said quietly. Daniels frowned. "A reminder of what?" The man didn't answer immediately. Rain continued to fall steadily around them. Finally, he looked back up. His voice was softer now. "A mission," he said. Daniels felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of mission?" The man's eyes grew distant. The calm expression returned, but this time it carried weight. "The kind you never forget," he said. And suddenly Officer Daniels realized something important. He and Reed had laughed at that tattoo. They had treated it like a joke. But whatever those numbers represented, it clearly wasn't funny. The rain continued falling softly on the empty highway. Water rolled down the truck's windshield in thin streams, and the dim glow of the patrol car lights reflected across the wet pavement. Officer Daniels stood beside the driver's window, his eyes still fixed on the strange tattoo. Only a few minutes earlier, he and Reed had been laughing about it. Now the atmosphere felt completely different. Heavy, serious. Daniels folded his arms and looked at the man carefully. "You said that tattoo marked a location," Daniels said. The man nodded slightly. "Yes." Officer Reed shifted uncomfortably beside him. "What kind of location?" Reed asked. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at his forearm again, slowly tracing the lines of the tattoo with his thumb. For a moment, it seemed like he was remembering something far away, something buried in the past. Daniels noticed a change in his expression. Was it a mission site? Daniels asked quietly. The man exhaled slowly. "Yes." Daniels and Reed exchanged a quick glance. Daniels had been right. The strange numbers weren't random at all. They were coordinates. Real coordinates. But one question still remained. Why tattoo it? Reed asked, "Why put something like that on your arm?" The man leaned back slightly in the driver's seat. "It wasn't originally supposed to be a tattoo," he said. Daniels frowned. "What do you mean?" The man paused for a moment before speaking again. "Years ago, I was part of a small unit," he began. "We were sent into places most people never hear about. Remote locations. Danger zones." Daniels listened carefully. Reed crossed his arms, now completely focused on the story. "We use coordinate grids like this one." The man continued, pointing at the tattoo. Each number represented a specific location point. Daniels nodded. "I remember something similar from training," he said. The man gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "Then you probably know," he said, "that some missions stay classified forever." Daniels didn't respond, but his silence showed he understood. The man looked down at the tattoo again. "This one marked the objective point," he said. Reed frowned. "Objective for what?" The man hesitated again. Then he answered simply, "A rescue." Daniels raised his eyebrows slightly. "A rescue mission?" "Yes." The rain grew heavier outside. A car passed far down the highway, its headlights briefly lighting up the scene before disappearing into the darkness. Daniels leaned slightly closer. "What happened there?" he asked. The man was quiet for a long moment. His eyes seemed distant now, as if the highway in front of him had disappeared and been replaced by something else entirely. "A lot happened," he said softly. Reed shifted his weight again. "Well, you can't just say that and stop there," Reed said. The man gave a faint smile. "Fair point." He looked back down at the tattoo. "Years ago," he began again, "we received intel that a group of civilians had been captured during a conflict zone evacuation." Daniels listened closely. "They were being held at a remote compound," the man continued. "Deep in the mountains." Reed frowned. "How many civilians?" "7," the man replied. Daniels felt a small knot form in his stomach. "And your team was sent to get them out?" The man nodded. "Yes." Reed looked impressed. "That sounds like something out of a movie." The man shook his head slowly. Movies make it look easy, he said. Daniels could hear something heavy in the man's voice now. Something painful. What went wrong? Daniels asked quietly. The man's eyes stayed on the tattoo. Our intel was incomplete, he said. Reed frowned. Incomplete how? There were more enemies there than expected. The man replied. Daniels understood immediately. Ambush. The worst situation for any tactical unit. The man continued speaking slowly. We got the civilians out, he said. Reed's face brightened slightly. So the mission was successful? The man didn't smile. Yes, he said. Then he added quietly, but not everyone came home. Silence filled the air. The rain was the only sound now. Daniels looked down at the tattoo again. Suddenly the strange numbers felt very different. This wasn't just a code. It was a memory, a painful one. How many? Daniels asked softly. The man swallowed slightly. 3, he said. Reed lowered his gaze. 3 soldiers. Gone. Daniels felt a wave of respect, replacing the earlier laughter he had felt. That coordinate, Daniels said, pointing at the tattoo. That's where it happened? The man nodded slowly. Yes. Reed looked confused. But why tattoo it? He asked again. The man rubbed the inked lines gently. Because I never wanted to forget it, he said. Daniels studied his face carefully. You think you might forget something like that? Daniels asked. The man shook his head. No. Then he added quietly, but memories fade over time. His finger followed one of the lines in the tattoo. This doesn't fade. Reed stared at the tattoo again. What had once looked like a strange collection of numbers now felt completely different. Those numbers marked a place. A real place. A place where lives were saved and lives were lost. Daniels leaned back slightly from the truck window. I'm sorry, he said quietly. The man looked up. For what? For laughing earlier, Daniels replied. The man gave a small shrug. Most people think it's just weird ink. Daniels shook his head. It's not weird. He pointed toward the tattoo. That's a story. The man looked down at it again. Yes, he said softly. It is. Reed stood silently beside Daniels, his earlier joking attitude completely gone. Now, he understood something important. They hadn't been looking at random artwork earlier. They had been looking at something far deeper. A silent memorial. A permanent reminder of a mission that changed lives forever. Daniels glanced at Reed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Daniels looked back at the man in the truck. What was your unit called? He asked. The man smiled faintly. You already know the answer to that. Daniels nodded slowly. Units like that rarely had names spoken out loud. They were the ones who went into dangerous places quietly, and left quietly too. Daniels looked once more at the tattoo. Now it no longer looked strange. It looked powerful. And suddenly he understood why the man carried it with him everywhere. For a few moments, no one spoke. Rain continued falling on the quiet highway, tapping softly against the truck's hood and the pavement below. The flashing lights of a patrol car painted the scene in shifting red and blue reflections. Officer Daniels stood beside the driver's window, staring once more at the tattoo on the man's forearm. But now it looked completely different to him. Just a few minutes ago, he had seen it as something strange, something almost funny. Now he understood. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a memory, a map of a place where people had risked their lives to save others. Daniel slowly straightened his posture. Officer Reed remained beside him, silent, still thinking about everything the man had just said. 7 civilians rescued, 3 soldiers who never came back. The highway suddenly felt very quiet. Daniels took a deep breath. Mr. Carter, he said respectfully. The man looked up. Yes. Daniels held out the driver's license and registration papers again. Everything checks out, he said calmly. The man reached out and took the documents. Thank you. Daniels hesitated for a moment. Then he said something he didn't often say during traffic stops. I owe you an apology. The man raised an eyebrow slightly. For what? Daniels glanced briefly at the tattoo. For earlier, he said, when we laughed. The man looked down at his arm again. Then he gave a small, understanding smile. It's all right, he said. People usually don't know what it means. Reed nodded slowly. That's true, Reed said. We definitely didn't. The man leaned back slightly in his seat. Most people think it's just strange artwork, he said. Daniels shook his head. Not anymore. The man looked at him curiously. Daniels took a small step back from the truck window. Then, without saying another word, he stood straight and raised his hand in a formal salute. Officer Reed looked surprised at first. Traffic stops rarely ended this way. But after a second, Reed understood. He straightened his posture as well and gave the same salute. Inside the truck, the man looked slightly uncomfortable. You don't have to do that, he said quietly. Daniels kept his hand raised for a moment longer before lowering it. Yes, he said calmly. I do. The man looked at him for a second, then slowly nodded. There was a quiet respect in his eyes now. Not pride, just mutual understanding. Daniels rested his hands on his belt and looked down at the tattoo once more. You said that mission saved 7 people. Daniels said, Yes, the man replied. Daniels nodded. Then those numbers deserve to be remembered. The man looked down at his arm again. His finger gently traced a thin line that ran to the pattern of coordinates. They deserve more than that, he said softly. Reed shifted slightly beside Daniels. Do the families know what happened? Reed asked. The man thought for a moment. Some of it, he said. Not all. Daniels understood what that meant. Certain missions stayed classified. The full story would never be told publicly. The heroes behind them would remain mostly unknown. The man in the truck looked back toward the road ahead. It doesn't really matter who knows, he said. Daniels tilted his head slightly. What do you mean? The man looked back at the tattoo. What matters is that those people made it home, he said. Daniels felt a quiet respect growing inside him. Some people served their country loudly. Others did it quietly, in the shadows. And sometimes the only record of those moments existed in memories, or small symbols like the one inked on that man's arm. Daniels stepped back from the truck window. Well, he said, I won't keep you any longer. The man nodded. I appreciate that. He started the truck engine. The old pickup rumbled softly to life. Daniels tapped lightly on the roof of the truck. Drive. Safe tonight. I will, the man replied. Reed stepped aside as the truck slowly began moving forward. The tires rolled gently across the wet pavement as the pickup pulled back onto the highway. Within seconds, the vehicle merged the road and began disappearing into the darkness. Daniels stood there watching the red taillights fade into the rain. For a long moment, neither officer spoke. Finally, Reed broke the silence. That was unexpected, he said. Daniels nodded slowly. Yeah. Reed looked down the highway where the truck had vanished. You think he was telling the truth about everything? Daniels didn't hesitate. Yes. Reed crossed his arms. How can you be so sure? Daniels looked back at the empty road. Because I've seen that look before, he said. What look? Daniels thought for a moment. The kind of look people have after they've seen things most of us never will. Reed nodded slowly. The rain began to lighten slightly. Daniels walked back toward the patrol car. Before getting inside, he paused for a moment and glanced down at his own arm. It was completely blank. No tattoos. No reminders. But the image of that strange pattern was now burned into his memory. Reed opened the passenger door. You coming? He asked. Daniels nodded and climbed into the driver's seat. The patrol car lights continued flashing softly in the rain. Reed looked over at him. You know, Reed said, earlier I thought that tattoo looked ridiculous. Daniels started the engine. Yeah, he said. Me too. Reed stared out the windshield. Funny how things change once you know the story behind them. Daniels slowly pulled the patrol car back onto the highway. As they drove forward into the night, he spoke quietly. Sometimes the things we laugh at, he paused for a moment, carry the heaviest stories. The patrol car disappeared down the road, leaving the quiet highway behind. And somewhere far ahead, an old pickup truck continued its journey through the rain, carrying with a memory that would never fade.